2 days ago my grandpa died, and for the first time in over a decade I entered his study. It was old age, the doctor said. He was 72 years old when his heart simply stopped working. Grandpa was the nicest man I knew. As long as I can think back, I lived with him and Mom. I never got to know my real father. All I know about him is that he was a good-for-nothing drunk. As soon as he found out that Mom was pregnant, he left. Things weren't that different for me though. My grandpa did his best to fill the void. I really loved the old man. He was amazing and told me many stories about his life. He'd been a sailor for a year, worked as a cowboy, and did many other similar things. He also was the smartest man I knew when I was a kid. Whatever question I asked him, he always had an answer. Even when I got older and went to school and finally college, I was still really close to the old man. He'd often tell me about my grandma. She was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in his whole life. He never told me what had happened to her. But when I asked Mom, she told me that Grandma had died a long time ago due to a fatal illness. There was one thing I found a little strange about Grandpa. It was a study. I was not allowed to enter it, not at any time. There were no exceptions. It was simply off limits. As a kid, I'd sneaked in once to find out what he was hiding in there. I'd expected it to be hidden treasures or old artifacts, things that he had found in his youth. When he entered and saw me in there, he freaked out and got really mad. He screamed at me and raised his hands to beat me when my mom entered the room. I remember that the two of them got into a huge fight because of it. A day later I apologized to Grandpa and told him I'd never do it again. I kept my word until yesterday. I'd found Grandpa's body in the hallway where I must have collapsed in the middle of the night. We called the doctor right away and soon after the mortician. The next day my mom left. She told me she had to take care of a few things, like to discuss the details of the funeral or get in contact with relatives. I was all alone in the house. To be honest, it felt pretty weird. Before that, it had always been the three of us. Now, it was only me. As I walked through the living room and saw Grandpa's books and his reading chair, I remembered the study. I thought about the promise I'd given him, but I guess he wouldn't be too mad at me now. I'd been curious about it my whole life. Now that I was older, I wondered about it even more. Had it something to do with his past? Or maybe with my grandma? Maybe he dedicated the room to her and filled it with mementos of their life together. When I opened the door, I felt as if I was doing something forbidden. I hesitated for a short moment and murmured an apology to Grandpa. Then I stepped inside. I saw nothing unusual. There were more books in here, which didn't surprise me. He'd always been an avid reader. Old notes and maps were stacked away in a corner, probably from the time of his youth. But these things couldn't be the reason. As I opened one of the cabinets in the room, I found a number of photo albums. The first one had the name Emily written on it. For a moment I wondered who Emily was before I remembered that it was the name of my grandma. It was a topic that simply never came up, and looking back, I hadn't heard the name more than a couple of times. I opened the album and for the first time I saw what my grandma really looked like. She had been beautiful, and I saw where my mom had gotten her good looks from. There were pictures of her and my grandpa together, and I could see how happy and in love they were. There were really only 3 albums dedicated to her, and the last one was quite depressing. From page to page, my grandma transformed from a beautiful young woman to a sickly, thin shadow of her former self. I don't know what sort of illness it was, but it must have progressed quickly. I closed the albums and carefully placed them on his desk before I went back to the cabinet. There were many other photo albums in there, and they all had the name Rebecca written on it. My mom's name. Many of them showed her as a child. I had heard that Grandma died when my mom was only 4 years old. After that, Grandpa had most likely devoted his life to his daughter. There were just so many albums, at least one for every year of her life. I sat down and started to go through them page by page. Seeing my mom as a little girl made me smile. I saw her on her first little bicycle and laughed as I saw how grumpy she looked on her first day of school. There were many other events like holidays and Christmas. As I continued on, I saw my mom slowly getting older and eventually reaching puberty. It was here that I noticed the albums getting a bit more personal and intimate. Before it had been pictures of Grandpa playing with her and pictures of her with family or friends. Now, at the age of 15, there were more and more pictures of her alone. I noticed that while she was smiling in most of them, there were a couple of others in which she seemed really annoyed at him. I felt a little awkward looking at these pictures. It was the next album when things started to get disturbing. Why were there so many pictures of my mom in a bikini? It was almost half the album. The pictures themselves weren't normal at all either. Many of them showed her in strange poses, bending over, laying on her towel or running towards the water. The rest of the album consisted of the occasional picture of normal events. It seemed as if Grandpa had been mostly interested in taking pictures of her during summer. I told myself that they might have been on a summer vacation together, maybe in the Caribbean or another exotic location, and he just wanted to keep the memory fresh. I tried to believe it and told myself that there was nothing wrong. When I started the next album, all those doubts vanished instantly. After the third picture of my mom sleeping in her underwear, I closed the album. Oh, Grandpa, what is this? Then it hit me. I opened my grandma's album again and looked at the pictures of my mother in her late teens. They looked almost identical. Oh God, no, I said to myself. I had enough of the albums for now. I couldn't bring myself to look at any more of those pictures. It wasn't long before I found a stack of notebooks in his desk. I opened the first one and started to read. I knew I had found my grandpa's diaries. I spent the next hours reading through them, and it was in there that I found out who he really was and read about all the immoralities he had committed. He hadn't taken his wife's death well, and many of the earlier entries went on and on about her. In time this changed and the topic shifted from his wife to his daughter. He developed a sort of obsession with her well-being. As my mom became a teenager and reached puberty, fatherly love was slowly replaced by an attraction and soon a desire. I started crying when I reached the parts in which he talked about the things he wanted to do with her and later did. All those forbidden things that no father should ever do with his daughter. It wasn't long before I read about the pregnancy. My mother didn't want an abortion and Grandpa was furious about it. She wanted to keep her little girl, she said. That's when it hit me. I vomited right there in the study and was shaking uncontrollably. It took me so long to calm down. There was a reason why I never heard so much as a name about my father. There was a reason my mom never got any child support. Right here was the reason why Grandpa never wanted me to enter his study. I shouldn't find out that he raped his daughter every night and got her pregnant. I shouldn't find out that my father, who I'd hated so much for abandoning us, was not a good for nothing but instead my own grandpa. I shouldn't find out that the man who I'd loved all my life was my mom's rapist. In the diaries he talked about what he'd do if my mother ever tried to leave him or tell anyone about what he did. He'd do the same things to me. I can only imagine what sufferings my mom went through living with this man all her life and seeing her own child playing with him. I can only imagine what hell my happy childhood and teenage years were for her. The fear she must have felt about what Grandpa would do to me. It was the day that I got a call from the police. They needed me to identify someone. I didn't have to ask. As I stood there crying in the middle of the empty living room, I knew that my mom had been finally able to leave this wretched life of hers behind.